We heard a tribute to Conway and a number of other gentlemen yesterday, and I figured I would do a tribute to the men that created the Zometool, Clark Richert, Mark Pelletier, and Steve Baer. So Clark Richert actually died on Christmas Eve of last year, and it's really heartbreaking for me. We also lost Mark Pelletier about 5 years ago in 2017. And I'm basically going to just talk about some oral history or stories that I heard from these fellows about how they came together. And the first chapter is Clark Richert graduates from the University of Kansas in Wichita with a degree in art. And like any serious young man with an art degree, he did the thing that anyone would do. He moved back in with his parents. And his mother would prepare him breakfast every morning. His father would very helpfully prop up the want ads against the orange juice. And it slowly dawned on Clark that he needed to get a job. And I guess you can guess where he got a job. Well, he was there during the first day, he was taking the buns off of the conveyor belt. That was his job, the hot buns on the hot conveyor belt. And well, he kept burning his fingers and he couldn't keep up with it. So he came up with a unique and creative way of removing the buns, which was using 4 fingers in each hand. He could get 8 buns at a time. After about 3 days, his boss, his manager, came in and said, "Clark, in the fast food business, some people have it and some people don't, and you don't have it." So here we see Clark, he's walking home, and he's going, "Now what am I going to tell my dad? I got fired from McDonald's." Well, as it turns out, there was a letter waiting for him from the Container Corporation of America, and it said, "As one of America's most promising young artists, you've been chosen to represent the Container Corporation of America, and you're going to get a full-page spread in Time magazine, and by the way, here's a check for 18 grand. And this was in 1962, I think, or 63. His father said, "Oh, maybe there's something to this art nonsense after all." Clark took the money, and he decided, he and his roommates, Gene and Joanne Bernofsky, had been practicing something called drop art up to this point, which involved doing things like dropping a mattress off the top of their apartment building in the middle of the street and seeing how people reacted to it. One of his favorites was they plugged an iron into a parking meter in downtown Lawrence, Kansas. But they decided that it wasn't enough to do their drop art, they had to live their drop art, and so they took Clark and I think Joanne and Gene took a long trip around the West, about a 1,000-mile arc through the southwest of the US, and ended up at Trinidad, Colorado, and chose a piece of ground that they bought for about $175, 7 acres, and started Drop City. So the next scene in this story is Steve Baer meets Clark Richert. And in the first picture, the sort of low-resolution one with Clark standing under the cat, well, that cat might as well be Baer, because when Baer showed up, he drove up in his pickup, he runs out, he jumps onto the dome, starts climbing up, and Clark's going, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." And as you can see, this geodesic dome was made up of scraps of lumber from the local lumber yard in Trinidad, and he had to kind of butt join together these little pieces. So every single one of those studs was just nailed together with 2 other chunks of 2x4. And as soon as Baer saw that, he turned into the cat and just backed up and climbed down very slowly. Next scene, we have several years later, Baer manufactures a house for Clark. It's called the car-top dome, and here it is. It's an exploded rhombic dodecahedron built in the Zometool's blue, yellow, and green lines in one cube, and terribly complicated to make. You would never do it that way these days, but it was made out of car tops. And at Drop City, often the TV stations would show up so that they could do a little spot on Drop City. And of course, it always started out, here we see the hippies at Drop City dropping acid. And they wanted to interview Clark about his house, and he said, okay, but don't say, here we see the hippies at Drop City dropping acid. And said, oh, no, we won't do that. No, not at all. And of course, and when the thing actually aired, here we see the hippies dropping acid at Drop City. But they did interview Clark about the house, and Clark told them, this house cost us $8 to build. And another artist, Richard Callway, interrupted and said, no, Clark, it cost us $12. You forgot the screws. Next scene. Steve Baer discovers the 31 zone system. Now this is an interesting story. When he was actually in Switzerland in the army and also attending math classes at the ETH in Zurich in the 60s. And his wife Holly gave him a little toy that was made up of these rectangles that you could snap together at the corners. And so one of the first things that Baer built was a lesser rhombicosidodecahedron, which is kind of odd because that ended up being the shape-coded node for the Zometool, and yet he hadn't discovered the 31 zone system yet. But he did have a love affair with the rhombicosidodecahedron from the start. I asked him how he knew that the red lines were cosine 18 in relation to the blue lines. The dodec or the icosahedron there is in the wrong colors. Obviously, it should be blue. And well, he said, "Well, Paul, that's where the pipes bumped into each other." And I'm like, "Huh?" So what they had done, like any hip, they had made a geodesic dome. You get a bunch of conduit, maybe 30 pieces of conduit, and you flatten the ends, and you drill a hole, and you screw them together into triangles, and you'll get a one-frequency geodesic sphere. In other words, an icosahedron or a very dangerous playground climber. But Baer went further because they wanted to know what if they went to the body center of the icosahedron from all the vertices. And they figured it was just, well, look, it must be just 20 tetrahedra all joined together. And of course, they thought they were regular tetrahedra, and quite surprised when all of the pipes were about 5% too long. But Baer went ahead and did it. He had the mathematical chops to figure this out. Most of you are probably aware that the icosahedron has 5 sets of 3 interpenetrating golden rectangles. So if you take one of those golden rectangles, there's going to be the body center going right through it. And since it's a golden rectangle, you can obviously figure from Pythagoras that it's going to be, the tau squared plus 1 squared divided by 2 because it's going to the center. So this by Pythagoras you can get that as cosine 18. But Baer was the only one with the mathematical chops to figure that out. And he was also already aware of the body-centered cube, which is the Zometool yellow line. And so he basically, when he realized that those two were part of the same thing, that they were all one system, he flipped. He said he was high for 2 weeks. And he was one of the hippies that didn't smoke pot. So next we have Clark Richert designing the pattern for the Zomeworks bus, and you can see they actually did the design for the sign. Okay, brilliant. Another genius in the room. Okay, so this is where Clark actually discovered quasicrystals in a sense, because as you can see, the projection of the rhombic triconahedron on the end of the bus there, it's a 5-fold shadow. You can do it yourself if you build a tricon in the Zometool and you hold it up, point a red strut right toward the sun. And what you'll get is these 5 skinny and 5 fat Penrose diamonds. Now, Clark actually incorporated that into a number of paintings that he made from about 1969 on. This is called The Tree of Life, and it was a poster that he did in order to earn money while they were living at Drop City. So the interesting story here, the next painting is the true story of the quasi-crystal that he painted around 1980. And if you look very carefully, you'll even see the Scientific American there over in the shelf that had the Roger Penrose article that Martin Gardner wrote. The interesting thing is that we normally have this hierarchy or a kind of a progression of discovery in our minds. We think, well, we observe nature, and then the scientists kind of distill what's going on, and the mathematicians hammer that into these laws that can't be broken. And then maybe the artist will start riffing on it. But in the case of Clark, it was the exact opposite. He was riffing on this thing, and then it was in the air maybe, and Penrose picked it up and started theorizing that you could make quasi-crystals, and then Schechtman actually discovered them at NBS when he was working there in Gaithersburg, so it kind of went the opposite direction. And in fact, at first they were hellishly difficult to make. You'd have to cool them at millions of degrees per second, these aluminum manganese alloys, and after a while, people could anneal them for 2 or 3 days and they would work. So it's a really odd thing. And these crystals, as far as we know, have never been found on Earth, so it's almost like we cooked them up. 6 seconds left? Oh, sorry about that. Well, let me tell you about the gift. There's several, it's a Zometool kit in which you can make a mini sculpture upstairs. Couple of rules with the Zometool: take it apart, don't break it apart. If you stomp on it or if you do that, you'll break the ends off. If it works perfectly. So have fun, everything fits together well, and thanks a lot.